So, David Chalmers coined the phrase hard problem of consciousness to distinguish it from the soft problems of the mind. An example of the latter would be the biological mechanism behind vision. Light hits the retina and the electromagnetic energy is transformed into electrochemical procedures in the nervous system, and the neuronal firings are encoded in the visual cortex to process the retinotopic mapping of the visual scene. So we understand much of the clockwork and how it has an influence on sight. We understand the causality of what light does to the molecules in our bodies. But what doesn't make sense is how you get the something that it's like to see from that physical system. There is no mechanism inside the brain that intuitively explains the awareness of vision, and it gets worse. We can't even imagine what type of physical configuration would explain phenomenal consciousness. Like, for instance, why should the angles at which the neurons are firing, or the frequency, or even the makeup of what is firing make any difference? Change the parameters. Change any parameter you like that would seem to make the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness, and you're still left with a profound mystery. But yeah, I mean, if materialism is true, and a specific cerebral configuration is involved in the production of consciousness somehow, then if that's really how things work, then perhaps me being human is what's stopping me from understanding that process. But this alternative to me seems counterintuitive, given the fact that so far everything to do with causation seems to be perspicuous, apart from the brute fact of subjective experience itself. So, now I've always said that if God doesn't exist, it doesn't necessarily mean there is no hereafter. I do think the concept of God usually tends to be poorly defined and most likely an entirely human inception. I think it's a concept that's been used to manipulate people. I think God, those who claim to know the mind of God usually have a nefarious agenda. They use it to control. This is what's best for you because I'm in touch with the creator, your maker, and is a perfect being, and I'm his messenger, and therefore you should listen to everything I say and do as you're told. And religion is very effective in bringing people together, in creating communities, but at the same time it's also effective in controlling people, in getting people to behave a certain way. It can bring about some order, but it's not without its cons, that's for sure. So now, I do think the concept of God tends to be poorly defined, and most likely, this is the source of a lot of confusion and disagreements between people. So Ignosticism, or Atheism if you prefer, has some credit, but generally, especially regarding the Abrahamic gods, I consider myself at present to be a de facto atheist. I find gods and deities to be highly improbable, and the lack of compelling evidence doesn't warrant my belief. To me, God is as probable as a fairy. I don't know if fairies exist or not. I would never try to claim that fairies definitely don't exist, otherwise I would incur the burden of proof on myself. But I definitely behave as though fairies don't exist. There are some people who claim to know for a fact that fairies exist. They say they have encountered them. Some have taken pictures of fairies, like the Cottingham fairies, but they were found to be hoaxes. People lie, people hallucinate, people can be mistaken about what they see. So, and I really don't see how fairies can actually exist, but they might do. And if they do, they are very elusive. But so far I've seen no evidence for the existence of fairies, so there's no reason why I should entertain a belief in them. So my position is actually one of skepticism. Reasonable doubt here is warranted. It's required, and it justifies my agnostic atheism. It's a reasonable position to have regarding God. So, but let's entertain the idea of God, supposing there is a hierarchy of conscious agents. Say all conscious agents put together define an overmind which exists prior to everything. Can we call this God? Can we actually say that God exists from the in the consciousness context? Let's try to define God loosely, but without contradictions. If it's limitless, it can't be defined in finite terms or by physical manifestations. So we won't find it in the physical world unless we believe it's absolutely everything and panpsychism is true. God is of supreme importance, according to most people, most pious people. So sometimes it can be synonymous with the telos. As Cicero put it, that which isn't a means to anything else, but to which all else is a means, is like God. In the context of a hierarchy of values, you should aim at what's at the top. And what's at the top would be a perfect being, a perfect thing, a perfect ideal, and you'd be a fool not to follow it. Even though such God would find no physical manifestation. I mean, after all, how can an infinite being manifest in a finite form? It would have to limit itself. So, it would have to be everywhere. And if that being doesn't really exist, if it's an entirely human concept, then if it's just an abstraction, then the existence of the abstraction is really good and serves as an impetus for us to try and improve ourselves. I mean, we can be inspired by it. We can be in awe of such abstraction, and that alone is enough. It would be, as Jordan Peterson sometimes says, true enough for us to take action. It doesn't need to have a physical existence, it just needs a mental one, and that's enough influence for us to it's funny how something that doesn't exist physically can have such an impact on the actions, on the behavior of human beings. That's really something. So and where does this concept come from? How does it even form in human minds? If if you're coming from a physicalist perspective, the idea of God really can seem a bit puzzling, but perhaps it can be understood in purely psychological terms. Maybe the fact that we are creatures trying to survive in a Darwinian world, and we encounter so many dangers, and we in the process become aware of our shortcomings, and sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we are disadvantaged, and that prompts us to try and help ourselves, to try and survive, to do what we can, and according to Bayesian models of the brain, and apparently the brain is a remarkable organ that can take into account past experiences. It can also be aware of what's around us and what's happening with present events, and also can try and make predictions about what's likely to happen. So it tries to make models of the future based on what it currently perceives at present as a remarkable organ that has some predictive power. It's not surprising that it would also try to circumvent the problems it predicts. It actually survives by coming up with the worst scenarios possible. It can actually outdo reality in terms of how horrible it can be. Imagine the absolute worst, and you'll be okay. You'll always be one step ahead. If you hear a sound in the forest, don't assume it's the wind. Assume it's a terrifying predator such as a lion or a tiger, and run. Just run without even having evidence for what it might be. Don't assume it's the wind. You're more likely to survive if you have a very pessimistic view of the world. So and obviously, perhaps psychologically speaking, we would start thinking, how can I just make myself so powerful that I would be able to surmount any problem that presents itself. And yeah, I guess that would eventually lead to the concept of a perfect being, what we strive towards. It would be, the God concept, and it would lead to other psychological states and pathologies like the God complex. So it's not really surprising, I suppose, but it's amazing how where does this concept come from? This imagination, imagining a perfect being. When we ask this question, we start thinking about things like Plato's perfect forms, and that this world is but a shadow of a more perfect world that doesn't manifest. The physical world is just an imperfect shadow of a more perfect metaphysical world. It's definitely, this stuff is definitely redolent of Platonic realism, or Platonic idealism, if you like. So people say God is of supreme importance, sometimes synonymous with the telos, and the telos is a useful thing to have, and maybe that's why the Roman Empire was so successful in the world. But you should definitely strive towards what you value the most. Now, how can God be analogous to consciousness? Someone could say, well, I have no evidence that God exists, but if idealism is true and consciousness gives rise to everything, then I could say that consciousness is God, and it's everywhere, and actually it's the only reality. It's not just a bedrock of this reality, which is nothing but a mental construct. It's actually the only medium. It's the only thing that really exists, and if that's the case, then consciousness is pretty important, as nothing can be said to exist without it. But people also think of God as a perfect being, and things obviously aren't perfect around us, but we can only make that assessment from an anthropic perspective. But then you also have to consider that consciousness gives rise, from an idealistic standpoint, it gives rise to, I'm talking about metaphysical idealism here, it gives rise to the existence of everything, such as an infinitude of worlds, according to Donald Hoffman. Anyway, it's from consciousness you get the decorated permutations, and you get geometries that have to exist outside the space-time of this reality, and you get the amplituhedrons, and they will give rise to headsets like our cheap space-time reality, and everything else that exists within Cantor's hierarchy of conscious agents and realities. So it's sets of infinities within other sets of infinities, and we don't even know what's possible. And then when we try to define things and try to create maps based on on concepts on limited concepts that we've been exposed to with our limited human minds from the anthropic perspective is very limited. You know, we come across certain paradoxes like Russell's paradox, for example. You know, if a barber only shaves men who don't shave themselves, then does he fit the category of a man who doesn't shave himself? But if he shaves himself, then is he breaking the rule? Does he fit the category or does he not? You know, it's something along those lines. It's a very head spinning paradox. But yeah, maybe reason goes out the window. Reason, at least human logic, could be very limited and problematic. You know, perhaps there's only so far we can go. You know, there are some things that exist outside human purview, and hence the reason why we find so many things puzzling, and we can't even figure out what reality is made of. We only see the behavior of atoms, particles, wave functions, but we don't really know what that stuff is made of. But yeah, so consciousness, if it gives rise to existence, and in absolutely everything, you know, the existence of everything and an infinitude of worlds, then it's almost godlike. Then it is complete beyond human comprehension. God is also portrayed as an omniscient conscious being. Is that somehow analogous to consciousness, or is consciousness analogous to the God concept? Omniscient conscious being. Well, consciousness is awareness itself, so it's conscious. It's consciousness. You know, it's awareness itself. So, and thus capable of knowing of the existence of forms that make an appearance in its intrinsically formless field. So it encompasses practically everything. It's everywhere, and it has the potential to know everything that makes an appearance in its field, in the field of awareness. And if those appearances are illusions, if it's just, you know, if it's just Play-Doh or a bunch of mirages that we're playing with, not just visual but involving every sense, tactility, hearing, you know, absolutely everything, taste, every sensation that we can think of, the world of qualia, if they are just illusions, then they happen. But then again, illusions in what sense? Because if they make an appearance, then the appearance is their reality. The illusions, the concept of illusion only enters the equation if we try to interpret what we're perceiving, and if we think that if we start making assumptions about the nature of what we're perceiving, and then what's being perceived proves those assumptions wrong, then obviously from the standpoint of making an assumption, you can label what's being perceived as an illusion. But if you perceive the contents of consciousness with absolutely no preconceptions whatsoever, then you're just perceiving, and your perception is wide open to interpretation. You just take it as it is, as you know. So it's capable of knowing pretty much anything that makes an appearance in its field. One could even say that, if you subscribe to a non-physicalist monism, you could even say that it's the very medium of consciousness adopting these forms, but its default mode is formless. You can't pinpoint it. It's a substitute for true emptiness or nothingness. Nothingness can't exist, by its very definition. If it's nothing, then it has no existence. It doesn't make an appearance. So perhaps it's absolutely natural to have consciousness as the bedrock, the wellspring of reality, because you could not have nothingness, because nothingness is just a human concept. It's not, it would be, nothingness would be, the concept of nothing would be practically what's between my index fingers right now. It's a continuity of molecules. There's absolutely nothing in between. So there's no space, there's no time. It's just, you can practically go from one finger to the next. The line in between is nothing. It's there isn't anything there. It's just a continuity from one finger to the next. And if you go like that, if you separate the fingers and there's space between the fingers, well, that's not nothing. There is space, there is something between the fingers, and when you join the fingers again, there is something still. So actually nothing never makes an appearance. Nothing is just a human concept. It's just an abstraction that finds no existence in reality, because by its very own definition it can't. So something always has to exist, and the very basis of reality would have to be something that is prior to everything else. Nothing can get behind it, as Max Planck once said, and it would have to be dimensionless, immaterial, but it wouldn't be, and you can remove all content in consciousness. You can strip it of all mental constructs, and you can have pristine cognition. You could have consciousness empty of all its contents, but something would remain. It wouldn't be, the kind of emptiness that's talked about in Advaita Vedanta isn't, or in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, isn't absolute emptiness. I think people make that mistake of thinking that they mean absolutely nothing. Even the state of nirvana, the cessation of being, it's absolute nothingness, it's empty. I think people that make that mistake, when they say emptiness, they mean consciousness empty of all contents. But they do say that, and they do describe it as something radiant, a radiant emptiness, like a light that cannot be extinguished. It's unborn, it's uncaused, it's prior to everything, and it just has to exist, because you can't get nothingness at the basis. Nothingness is just an invention of the human mind. It can't find expression in space and time, and it certainly can't be prior to space and time, and it's less than the concept of mathematics, which I believe to be absolutely real. I think we invented the language of mathematics, but we didn't invent mathematics itself. Mathematics has always existed prior to the universe, to this universe, or this reality at least. It's maths contains concepts, truths which are eternal, independent of minds or the manifestation of physical realities. Maths is almost like a metaphysical signature there, like a foundation, and perhaps consciousness is even prior to mathematics, but maths creates the foundation for these realities to emerge, these mental constructs. So it's like the scaffolding of reality, because everything can be described in terms of mathematics. So the knowing, when it comes to consciousness, the knowing is synonymous with the being aware of something, and it is supremely important for beings such as ourselves striving for survival in a Darwinian context. You want to be aware of things around you. So, can consciousness be regarded as divine? Well, perhaps in the sense of a delightful liberation from conceptual reality, when one stumbles upon the rigpa state, where you come to know pristine awareness, which in Tibetan Buddhism is known as the ground of all being. So perhaps Tibetan Buddhists have always been aware of this and ahead of everybody else. But then again, you do find idealism expressed in the oldest religion in the world, Hinduism. Some passages in the Upanishads also seem to, within the context of something like Brahman and Atman, it does seem to allude to this pure consciousness, which is the ground of all being, and and that's the Lord, So you strip it of all mysticism and you strip those passages, those ancient religious texts, of their religious language, of and their poetry, and you actually find something which makes sense and is quite true. But so I've actually experienced pristine awareness, and it was very brief for me. It can be a very ephemeral state. You can see it, you can experience it, you can be in awe of it, and then you, as quickly as you experience it, you lose it, and then you're like, oh, I want to get back there. It's like you're stripped of all thoughts, and then thoughts can come flooding back in, and the bliss that you had is gradually lost because those thoughts are weighing you down again. But the blissful clarity that one can experience in such a state, with no distractions or illusions whatsoever, is unlike anything I've ever experienced, and I would love to glimpse it again in meditation. But again, if you seek to fit that subjective reality with purely religious terms, then you end up just playing a semantic game to preserve your religious dogma.